In the TOEFL integrated writing task, there is one task that you have to complete during the test time. The task itself involves 3 steps. Step 1 is reading an academic passage. Step 2 is listening to a mini lecture in which the reading will disappear. And then step 3, you have to write a response during the 20 minutes that you're given during the test. And the reading passage will reappear during this time. Now, in looking at the actual writing scoring rubric, again, we're focusing on the highest level scores. Again, the maximum score is a 5. The idea is to think about, again, the scoring is based on a holistic method. Now, let's look specifically at some of the language that they use in the task description. First off, you'll notice that it says that a successful task selects the important information from the lecture and coherently and accurately presents this information in relation to the relevant information presented in the reading. The response is well organized, and even though there are occasional language errors, they do not result in inaccurate or imprecise presentation of the material. So throughout this particular video, we'll be exploring just exactly what it means to talk about relevant information presented in the reading connected to the lecture, and then talk more specifically about the actual writing of the response. So first, let's talk about the reading passage. Now, in general, the passage itself will be generally academic in nature, and will be organized very much like you might see in an entry-level or freshman-level textbook or like an encyclopedia. Of course, it will also depend on the academic discipline that you're reading. Now, the purpose of the reading is generally to provide background information. Also, if there are any new ideas, vocabulary, words, concepts, they will be introduced as well in the reading. Now, in terms of the stance or the tone, now we're going to talk more about the stance of the professor in just a moment. But generally, you will notice that the reading will mostly be either positive or at least neutral in its particular tone or stance. So you'll notice that the reading itself will not be examining any negative ideas about the topic it's discussing. The reading itself also might be around 200, possibly more, but generally 200 to 250 words. And you're usually given 3 minutes to read the passage itself. So, our specific reading is involving forestry science. Now, some questions to consider while we're looking at the reading. First off, what do you already know about this topic? Do you know anything about forestry or forest science in general? Of course, what type of reading will it be? That often focuses on the type of organizational pattern that we see. Is it a pure science area, education, history? The idea is to think about how the general passage, how we can think about how it's organized and what expectations we can have from the reading. Now, as you're reading, we're generally going to try to identify 3 to 4 main points. And where can we find that information as we're reading? And finally, are there any new vocabulary words or concepts? And then, of course, how do you know? How does the reading introduce these ideas? Now, oftentimes students want to know, is it a good idea to take notes during this part of the test? And my general opinion is, you have only about 3 minutes, so I don't know necessarily that it's a good idea to take notes. I think it really depends on how fast you are as a reader, and even then I don't know that really it's a good idea to take a lot of notes. So I think the idea here is, as you're reading, probably think and identify about 3 to 4 main points or any new vocabulary words or ideas that the reading is going to try to address. These points will most likely be addressed in one way or the other by the professor. So I think that's one of the keys you have to understand. Now, as we mentioned right at the beginning, the reading will disappear during the listening passage, but it will return during the writing portion of the task. So, in other words, the reading will come back, and you can go back and refer to that. So, in this case, it might be better to focus more on the listening and then use the reading when it returns to try to find that key information. So I've placed the reading here on the screen. What I would like for you to do is to go ahead and consult the TOEFL Quick Prep download for the sample reading passage. We're going to go through the reading here in just a moment, but I'd like for you to go ahead and take some time to read it yourself. So go ahead and pause the video and take a few minutes to read the passage. Okay, let's go through now and discuss the reading itself. First off, if you notice, there are definitely a lot of vocabulary words here that might make it a little difficult at first for us to understand. Notice a lot of words that have multiple syllables, such as ecologically sustainable forestry practices. This seems to be a very interesting term here. But as we continue along, keep in mind, we're going to try to focus on not just these particular words, but most specifically words that the passage is trying to teach us. So, for example, let's think about the general nature of the passage. It's discussing the fact of issuing certifications to wood companies that meet certain ecological standards by conserving resources and recycling materials. Now, if you notice in this kind of passage here, I do see some quotation marks. Well, that's going to be important because obviously this piece of information is being taught to us. So when companies receive this certification, they can consider themselves to be eco-certified. Now, we could probably expect to hear that particular word or idea repeated by the professor as we prepare for the lecture. And of course, we see some other words that are kind of similar. Here's eco-certified and then eco-certification. Now, if you notice, though, in the reading passage, it does introduce the word however. So it's talking about it's unlikely that wood companies in the United States will do the same for several reasons. So this really is kind of the thesis of the reading passage that we're trying to understand. Now, as we said before, most of the time the reading will be positive to neutral. So it's possible here that they're going to be emphasizing some negative aspects. But let's keep reading and see if we can identify what are those main ideas. Well, if you notice, the reading passage is doing us a favor. It's actually helping us using these signal words for us to identify what we should be paying attention to, first, second, and third. Let's see if we can at least generally identify what the main ideas are. First off, they talk about the fact that so many American consumers may not even pay attention to the eco-certification label, mostly because so many mediocre products, now mediocre means not very good or kind of just generally okay. So the problem is there are too many products that have particular labels that might say new or improved. So American consumers may not place much trust in advertising claims in general. So again, this is point number one to think about. The labels themselves may not draw a lot of attention. Secondly, they talk about the fact that the wood might be more expensive than uncertified wood. And I think in some cases, in order to earn that eco-certification, a company may have to pay to have its business examined by a certification agency. And generally, this is where the cost gets passed on to consumers. So part of the idea here is that the product itself may become more expensive. And people may choose actually cheaper uncertified wood products. So in this case, it may actually produce the opposite effect. American wood companies may actually want to keep their prices low instead of just getting that eco-certification. So there's point number two. And then point number three, we think about the idea of making good business sense for American companies to keep up with developments. This may not necessarily be convincing. Certification might make sense for wood companies only if it marketed most of their products around the world, but that's not the case. Most American companies sell their products in the United States. So in their third idea, the idea here is that even though it seems like a good idea for the rest of the world, the truth is most American companies sell their products in the United States. So in this case, it seems that the passage is going to start off in a fairly positive way, but then it actually starts to focus on some negatives. So this is a little bit different from the expectation that you might see on the test. But these are the general points that we have identified in the reading. Now moving on to the listening passage. First off, we always have to ask ourselves who is speaking. Well, most likely it's going to be a professor, though that's not always the case. And then we have to think about what he or she is generally saying. Now, what you will notice is the professor will almost always be responding to the reading, possibly even giving more information or details. The lecture itself is generally going to be between 2 and 3 minutes, and we'll get a chance to listen to it here in just a moment. And during that time, I'd like for you to take notes. So as we said, during the listening passage itself, we probably should try to take notes, but also identify the professor's stance. And that's going to be... we should try to understand the professor's stance, because that's going to be key to understanding what the writing passage is going to be. So in thinking about the professor, we need to think about what's the professor's stance. And what are those 3 to 4 main points the professor discusses? Most likely he or she is going to discuss the points that the reading is trying to make. But also think about, does the professor mention any new vocabulary or concepts? Now, of course, we identified one new concept already in the reading, and that was the eco-certification. So as we continue to read, as we continue to follow along, maybe we will hear that word or some variation of that word throughout the professor's lecture. Now, we've been talking about stance. Now, this was an idea we used back in the TOEFL listening series. Let's go back and revisit that just for a moment. The professor's stance is something we're going to kind of notice fairly early on in the mini-lecture. Now, generally on this part of the test, the professor is going to have basically one of 2 possible opinions. He or she basically agrees with the information, and the purpose will be to add more information. Or the professor will basically disagree with the information, and will contrast the text with other ideas. So this is something we have to be able to identify almost immediately. Will the professor agree, or is the professor going to disagree? Now, in terms of thinking about words of agreement, so thinking about how do we know if the professor is going to be agreeing? Well, notice some of the ideas that we're going to be highlighting here. Using conjunctive adverbs or connectors, words such as also or in addition. Referent ideas such as other or another or the word additional. Other signal type words, words such as research or studies. Perhaps using the word further. Now, what about words that might signal disagreement? Again, there are several, but a professor might use words such as however, or but, or instead. The professor also might use negative adverbs, words such as not, or didn't. Or other negative words, such as problem, or difference. Perhaps even the words that indicate a certain negative idea, such as forgot, or something is missing. These are all examples of words that might kind of help indicate very quickly whether the professor is agreeing or disagreeing with the information. So in thinking about as we're listening, the key is to recognize that as we're taking notes, we can't just get the basic idea. This is something we talked about in the TOEFL listening series. We have to be able to get all of the details too. So in fact, the better responses to this TOEFL task involve accomplishing most or all of the following ideas when it comes to taking notes. If you recall, we said that you have to identify the professor's stance. Of course, we have to get information accurate. So for example, did you get all of the information correct? And did you get it in the right order? Now, key is, if you recall from the TOEFL listening series, you've got to follow the professor. As you take notes, follow the order that the professor is using. And again, that level of detail. Did you include all of the examples or details from the presentation? Now, keep in mind, with this particular activity, there could be an advantage and a disadvantage. One advantage is that the listening passage is much shorter than that on the listening part of the test. But the disadvantage is, since it's shorter, the person might be speaking more quickly, or it might be harder for you to get all of the information. So again, you have to be able to get all of the details. So there are some challenges here that maybe we didn't think about as compared to the listening passage. And of course, don't forget, in the response, we also need to identify some of those same vocabulary words or terminology that the professor uses. So, when taking notes, especially with this part of the test, since it is so short, it would be better to think of this as almost like taking dictation, in which you're trying to write down almost as much information as possible. Now, of course, this is not possible during the listening part of the test. So, when it comes to the integrated task, it really is important to try to catch everything if you can. Now, remember, you will be given some time during the writing portion. Obviously, you've got all of that time to write, but you can take maybe at least a minute or two to sort through your information so that you can at least try to figure out what the important points are. So remember, the professor will probably address the same 3 to 4 main points that are in the reading. The professor will probably also use a lot of the same vocabulary words or concepts. And keep in mind that despite thinking about whether the professor agrees or disagrees, the most important thing to recall, so some things to remember. First off, the professor will most likely address the same 3 to 4 points that we saw in the reading. Also remember that the professor will probably use the same vocabulary words or concepts that were introduced in the reading. But keep in mind, the professor will probably not just repeat the reading itself. So despite agreeing, it really doesn't matter. So some things to keep in mind. Remember, the professor will probably address the same 3 to 4 main points that are in the reading. The professor will most likely identify the same vocabulary words or concepts. And regardless of whether the professor agrees or disagrees, he or she is probably not going to repeat the reading passage, but most likely add information to it. So that's the thing we need to keep in mind. The professor is not going to just repeat everything, but probably continue to add to it. So regardless of whether he or she likes it or agrees with it, they're going to be still adding more information. And remember that the reading passage will disappear during the listening passage itself. Now, for this portion of the video, please don't look at the TOEFL Quick Prep download, because the idea here is I want you to kind of experience what it will be like on the actual test. So for now, we'll just go ahead and try to take notes during the listening passage, and then we'll be analyzing the transcript just a little bit later on in the video. So now we're going to listen to a part of the lecture on the topic you just read about. So again, recall here that I want you to take notes now, and try to identify, as you're taking those notes, what the professor's stance is going to be, and what his 3 to 4 main points are. Now listen to a part of the lecture on the topic you just read about. Well, despite what many people say, there's good reason to think that many American wood companies will eventually seek eco-certification for their wood products. First off, consumers in the United States don't treat all advertising the same. They distinguish between advertising claims that companies make about their own products and claims made by independent certification agencies. Americans have a lot of confidence in independent consumer agencies. Thus, ecologically minded Americans are likely to react very favorably to wood products ecologically certified by an independent organization with an international reputation for trustworthiness. Now, second point. Of course, it's true that American consumers care a lot about price. Who doesn't? But studies of how consumers make decisions show that price alone determines consumer decisions only when the price of one competing product is much higher or lower than another. When the price difference between two products is small, let's say less than 5%, as is the case with certified wood, Americans often do choose on factors other than price. And Americans are becoming increasingly convinced of the value of preserving and protecting the environment. And third, U.S. companies should definitely pay attention to what's going on in the wood business internationally. Not because of foreign consumers, but because of foreign competition. Now, as I just told you, there's a good chance that many American consumers will be interested in eco-certified products. And guess what? If American companies are slow capturing these customers, you can be sure that foreign companies will soon start crowding into the American market, offering eco-certified wood that domestic companies don't. Okay, so now we're going to look at the transcript. And the idea here is we're going to try to analyze the passage, first to identify the professor's stance, and then number two, to think about what the main points were. So first off, let's look right at the beginning again. Do we think that the professor is going to agree or disagree with the information? Well, if you look right at the beginning, the very first sentence, notice what he says. Well, despite what many people say. So in this case, first off, we notice the particular word he's using, despite. Is this a positive word or a negative word? Well, in this case, it's a negative word. So already we can get a sense that the professor is not agreeing with the information. And in fact, when the professor says what many people say, he's actually referring to, of course, the reading. This is what the reading says, and I am not going to agree with it. Now, you probably picked up even a little bit later that the professor disagreed, but this, even right in the very first sentence, the TOEFL is trying to show you how the professor could possibly agree or disagree with the information. Now, if you notice, the professor uses a lot of the same types of organizational style, using words such as first, okay, next or second, or so on. So notice in this first part, the professor is disagreeing with the information. Again, notice the words the professor is choosing to use. Consumers don't treat advertising the same. So the first point the professor is trying to make is that customers do distinguish between advertising claims because they have lots of confidence in independent consumer agencies. So in this case, the idea here is that the professor is using some repeated techniques because in the sentence before, he references the idea of independent certification agencies. So again, this is something we learn in the listening series. Oftentimes, professors will repeat or rephrase words in a lecture to help kind of emphasize important ideas and for information to kind of stick together. And notice how the professor kind of repeats it again. Ecologically certified by an independent organization. So our first point is listed here. He disagrees with the fact that consumers will not treat all products the same. He thinks that consumers will distinguish between these different products because they will trust an independent organization, especially if the organization has a reputation for trustworthiness. Okay, let's move on. Again, notice how the professor is using a lot of the same organizational words. Second, and then of course later he uses the word third. Now, keep in mind, since this lecture is fairly short, the professor is most likely going to disagree with every point in the reading, not just with some points. So that's why I generally say that if you can identify what the stance will be of the reading, the professor will most likely be the complete opposite. So in this case, the professor is disagreeing with each point and using the same organization. So of course he says, of course consumers care about price, but, so there's that word but, and then notice how he is adding more information, studies of how consumers make decisions. So keep in mind, sometimes the professor will be giving extra research information to help show a contradiction or how he or she disagrees with information that they're reading before. I mean, that's what professors do. They use studies or research to prove their particular point. So in this case, the idea here is that professor is saying, sure, prices do matter, but only if the price of one competing product is much higher or much lower than another. If the difference is small, so again, he uses the idea of less than 5%. So hopefully you caught that information while you were taking notes. So oftentimes this is the case with certified wood. Then generally Americans may think about other factors. So that's the idea. Americans are becoming much more convinced of the idea of preserving and protecting the environment. So notice how the professor in this case structures a particular argument by saying, well, price is important, but it's not the most important. Only when you have this particular difference. So notice again, the professor is kind of using words or ideas that kind of rephase or repeat itself. So higher or lower is essentially the same as thinking about a difference. But in this case, it's less, not much. So notice how the professor is contrasting that information here. All right, now in the third point, so there was the second point. The third point, obviously, again, referencing the idea of thinking about international business. But his particular argument says, and again, there's that negative language, not because of foreign consumers, but because of foreign competition. So, as we talked about before, there's a good chance that consumers will be interested in eco-certified products. So that's what he said earlier. And if American companies don't capture these customers fast enough, we said foreign companies will soon start crowding into the American market, offering eco-certified wood that domestic companies don't. So there's our third point. Now, you may be, hearing this or listening to this and say, there were a lot of words here that I didn't know. Well, the TOEFL again assumes that these are words that you would use in other kind of academic areas too. So keep in mind that even though much of this is the language that you might use in in studying forestry science, or the idea of studying probably ecology and the economy, the goal here is to recognize that you have to know these words already. These are not words that the test is trying to teach you. You need to know these before you listen. With the exception of eco-certification, which is what the test was trying to teach us about, you need to know these words already.
Now let's turn our attention to the writing passage of the integrated writing task.
So, first off, the prompt. There are generally two possible questions. How does the listening passage cast doubt or disagree with the reading? How does the professor add to the reading? Now, the general purpose, really, is to try to find a way to synthesize the two sources without necessarily repeating everything. Now, we're going to talk about this in just a moment as to how to actually frame your response. But the idea here is that generally you have to think about the listening passage in relation to the reading passage. Now, the TOEFL recommends that the length of your response probably should be somewhere between 150 and 225 words. Now, again, you have less time during the integrated task to write, plan, and revise. So in this case, you've only got 20 minutes instead of 30. But you will notice that the organization is not quite as formal as the independent writing task that we saw in the previous video series. Now, the key is to think about how the main points of the listening section are going to help you organize your written response. So, in general, we'll talk about the importance of cohesion, thinking about how we can make the particular passage sort of flow together. But you will notice that one difference is that you don't necessarily need a formal introduction or conclusion. That is definitely not what this particular part of the test is about. When you write, you need to make sure that you include key vocabulary words or concepts that are mentioned in the reading and listening sections. And remember, the reading passage will reappear during the written response itself. Now again, as we said before, you have only 20 minutes to write a response. But it is still important to take time at the beginning to plan and prepare. Now we'll discuss that a little bit more as we actually get to the writing of the task. So, in terms of understanding the prompt, as we said before, it's probably going to be pretty easy to predict what the prompt will be before the prompt actually appears, because it will most likely be connected to the professor's stance. Now think about what we heard in the lecture. Was the professor agreeing with the information or disagreeing? So the prompt itself will generally kind of relate to whether that professor agreed or disagreed. So in just a moment, when we see the actual prompt here, we're going to see if we can go back and think about what the professor's stance was. So if the professor added information instead of just disagreeing, then generally the prompt will ask about how he or she adds to it. So now, looking at the actual prompt, let's take a look. Summarize the points made in the lecture, being sure to explain how they cast doubt on specific points made in the reading passage. So this is the key here. The passage itself, the professor basically disagreed with the information. Now, as we go back and analyze the script itself, I think we will be able to point out very quickly how the professor expressed that particular doubt. So again, what do we notice from the prompt? Well, again, remember, it's not wanting a complete summary of the reading and listening passage. Again, that's not what we're looking for here. Instead, we need to think about using the organization and tone of the listening passage to help frame our response. So in this case, we do need some of the reading. Okay, that's very important. And in fact, you won't be able to get the highest level score if we don't include some information from the reading passage. But as we will explore in the second part of this video, as to when writing the response, we have to think about how can we connect what the professor was saying to what the reading passage was telling us. So, in getting ready to write our response, let's take a moment and go back and compare the basic ideas discussed in the reading and how the professor responds to those in the particular lecture. So first off, again, talking about the stance, as we said, most of the time the reading will probably take a stance of a positive to perhaps even neutral tone. But here you notice this is a little different. The reading here is basically disapproving of the idea of eco-certification. Now that might be a sign already that you can predict what the professor is going to do. Generally, if the reading takes a particular stance, either in one way, sort of a positive direction, or in a negative direction, you can probably guess that the professor is going to disagree with that stance. Well, anyway, let's go ahead and look at the points that the reading was trying to make. Again, let's review those. So in point number 1, the reading talked about the fact that consumers don't pay attention to labeling because too many companies use the idea of labeling, such as new and improved. So in this way, consumers will probably just kind of ignore that type of eco-certification label. Point number 2, basically the reading was emphasizing the fact that price is the ultimate factor when consumers determine what they're going to buy. And of course, wood that has eco-certification is usually more expensive. Therefore, people won't buy the product. And then finally, even though eco-certification might seem important, it's mostly important to foreign markets. And the problem, though, of course, is that American wood companies sell primarily to American markets, which means that, again, most people won't pay attention to those particular products. Now again, the professor's stance, as we said in general, is going to disagree with the reading. So remember, just because we disagree with something doesn't necessarily mean that they disagree with the topic itself. The professor actually likes eco-certification. So the idea here is that the professor is disagreeing with the reading stance. So I don't know necessarily we can consider the professor's stance positive, but certainly he's trying to point out the weaknesses in the argument of the reading. Well, let's go again through point by point. So first off, in the idea of labeling, his particular argument is that consumers do pay attention to labeling. And in fact, consumers today are much more ecologically aware. They're much more committed to, to recognizing the importance of companies paying attention to the environment. In point number 2, the professor does agree that price is important, but it's not the only factor. And in fact, the professor cited some research that if the price is only a 5% difference, either expensive or less, consumers usually will choose the product that has the certification because consumers generally trust these types of independent certified things. And then finally, the professor mentions that the real problem is not the idea of trying to sell American products to American markets, it's actually foreign competition. And the idea is that if people see foreign products on the market that are cheaper, they may not necessarily like those products. So really, eco-certification actually can provide an advantage. If you're comparing products that are, one is American and has the eco-certification, and one might be a cheaper foreign alternative, he believes that most people will buy the foreign product. So, when we're talking about the points that are trying to be made, and as we said before, the idea is that we're going to try to frame our response in the idea of how the professor's lecture connects to the reading. So this really is going to lead to our first writing idea, and that is writing the topic statement for our response. So this leads us to our first important point when it comes to actually writing the response, which will involve writing what we call the topic statement. So now we're going to transition and start looking at the actual writing process for writing the integrated task. Now really, if you really think about it, what the test is looking for in this particular task involves basically two fairly large areas. The first area, or step, is looking at writing the topic statement. The second area, or step, is involving writing the body of the response. And we're going to look at each one in more detail throughout the next part of the video here. So in thinking about the topic statement, now if we had to make a comparison, I guess you would say that the topic statement is somewhat similar to the thesis, or perhaps even the introduction of the independent writing task, in the sense that it helps set the direction for the rest of the response. However, I think you will notice it's probably not as formal or as involved as the thesis. Obviously in the thesis, we're trying to kind of give our particular opinions and ideas and explain them throughout the rest of the essay. Here, on the other hand, the topic statement really is going to try to accomplish basically two things. Now, of course, those two things can involve a little bit more than just a simple statement. So let's take a look at them. The first thing that the topic statement needs to accomplish is kind of recognize sort of the basic gist of the task, the basic idea. So how exactly is the topic itself framed? Well, you will see in just a moment that generally we find this idea in the reading. The second point that we need to accomplish in the topic statement is essentially identify what the stance of the professor is going to be between the lecture and the reading. Well, in our particular situation, the professor disagrees with the reading. This is something that also needs to be stated in this first part of the written response. Now, of course, we're calling it a statement, but you will see from our example that it's actually more like a paragraph, and that's perfectly fine. Of course, your time is much shorter on this part of the test, so I think what you're going to see here is a fairly lengthy topic statement, but then again, the TOEFL doesn't necessarily need something this detailed, but this is just for example purposes here. So in thinking about where does some of this information come from, well, again, getting the gist of the idea generally can be found in the first part, or the introduction of the reading itself. So really the gist, the kind of basic idea here, is that we're talking about this kind of eco-certification. And the fact that this eco-certification sort of is relating to the need for ecologically sustainable practices. So the key here is to think about that we're trying to connect what the professor is saying to the reading, and both are commenting on this practice of eco-certification. So notice how in our response, in our topic statement, how we kind of, in a way, summarize some of this information to at least help frame the argument. That's going to be important. So now let's look at this sample topic statement I've written for this video. The reading is discussing the idea of eco-certification, a process where an independent agency verifies that the wood used in a product meets high ecological standards of sustainability and is made from recycled materials. The reading disapproves of the eco-certification for several reasons. The professor, however, disagrees with the points made in the reading and thinks that there is value in this process. Now what we're going to be doing here is, first let's see how we try to recognize the basic gist of the task. Well, that's the part that I accomplished here in the beginning. I essentially summarized from the reading basically the idea of what we're discussing, which is this process of eco-certification. So this is accomplished pretty much at the first part of the topic statement. In the second part of the topic statement, we try to identify what the actual stance is. And of course, the key here is to think about the stance is really that the reading and the professor essentially disagree with each other. I kind of summarize what the reading stance is towards the actual topic, and then mention that the professor disagrees with the reading. So in a way, this is how the topic statement is going to get us ready for what we're going to be doing in the rest of the task. Now, I do think one of the things we need to talk about, and just kind of reminding us of what the purpose of the TOEFL ultimately is, and that is to kind of provide with the test taker the opportunity to understand what are the responsibilities and requirements of a university student. Well, the integrated task, I think there's really a reason why the integrated task is the last task, mainly because it helps kind of remind us that part of the challenge of being a university student is understanding how to take information from different sources of materials and put them together. So again, I think in this case, this is probably one of the most important ideas in academic learning, the concept of attribution. Now, what does attribution mean? Well, basically it's referring to the proper citation of sources when doing research and or presenting information from academic sources. So the idea here is recognizing if you've got some information that you're sharing, that you properly identify, well, where did it come from and who wrote it? For example, when reading a scientific article, you will often see names of the particular researchers or scientists or academicians in parentheses like this to indicate where the information came from and who wrote it. So even though you will not see that level of citation on the TOEFL, for example, you won't see the names of particular researchers most of the time, the integrated task is testing you to see if you're able to correctly summarize and attribute information to the right source. In other words, you have to be able to identify who said what, which information came from the reading, and which information came from the professor's lecture. Now again, this is something we immediately established in the topic statement. We actually helped accomplish that idea of attribution, especially looking at the stance in part 2. So that's why I think it's very important to signal to the reader that the reading is saying something and the professor is saying something different. So I think this is the key when we think about, what exactly is the TOEFL looking for. So part of the idea here is that the gist part of the topic statement, that comes from the reading. But it's really the second part, the stance, that helps you immediately demonstrate that importance of attribution. You are signaling to the reader that you know which information comes from the lecture and which comes from the reading. So, correct attribution, including getting all of the important details accurately and correctly identifying the stance of the professor, that's going to be especially important when actually writing the body of the task. But it really does begin in the topic statement. And again, I think this is important. This is what the TOEFL is looking for. Can you do this? Now, moving on to the second part of the body, let's go back just for a moment and review the steps in the topic statement. So again, the basic idea in the topic statement is we need to establish the gist of what the task is about. Again, we will usually find this in the reading, and usually in the introduction of the reading. And then, of course, during that time, we have to establish the stance, both of the reading and of the professor. So if the task especially is mentioning that the professor is casting doubt, then you need to make sure you indicate that the professor disagrees with the information in the reading. Now we're moving on to writing the body. Now again, this is a lot less formal than the independent writing task. So I think you will see, first off, we won't mention ideas such as, topic sentences or so on. The basic idea here is that you're trying to summarize or synthesize information. And you'll also notice that we don't mention the importance of writing a conclusion. So that part is also missing from the process. Really what I think the TOEFL is looking for is just your ability to put the two sources together in a very coherent way. So again, in writing the body, one of the first things you need to establish is that you actually got the information in the correct order. So first off, the task is asking us to think about the order of the lecture. So we need to think about the lecture, especially comparing and contrasting it with the reading. Of course, we need to include as many details as possible. Getting as much information in this particular task is extremely important if you want a high score. And don't forget that throughout, we need to correctly identify who said what. So, for example, if this is a point made in the reading, we need to clearly state that it's the reading, not the lecture, and vice versa. Now, here's the kind of thing we need to think about. And I think this is a trick, oftentimes, that other test publications that might try to teach you this particular task. Many times, other textbooks, or sometimes even students, think that the purpose is to summarize everything, to summarize the reading and the listening. And I think many times students want to know, is that really what we're looking for? Should I just summarize the reading first and then follow with a summary of the listening passage? Well, I don't think necessarily that's exactly what the task is asking you. And again, sometimes it might be necessary, but I think for this particular task, the idea here is, can you respond by framing the listening information against the reading? So again, think of this more as like a compare or contrast type of writing. We're going to indicate basically what the professor said, but it needs to reference at that time what the reading says. So again, as we see clearly from the task, again, look at the task itself. The prompt says, summarize the points made in the lecture, being sure to explain how they cast doubt on those specific points made in the reading passage. So again, I don't think it's the requirement here for you to summarize both sources. However, you probably will include a lot of the reading in basically summarizing the lecture. You have to, because it won't make any sense unless we know what the professor is actually responding to. So again, in looking at our comparison here, this is what we examined earlier in the video. The idea is to think about, I need to follow the order of the lecture. But if you notice, the lecture also follows the order of the reading. It actually addresses it point by point. That's fairly common on the TOEFL. I think that's basically designed to help you because you have so little time to read the information at the beginning. So the idea here is thinking about when you're writing your response, think about the professor's points where they directly comment on the points in the reading. In that way, you are including some information from the reading, but you're still focusing on the actual point of the task, how the lecture casts doubts on the points in the reading. Now again, you could do that, a couple of different ways, but we're going to demonstrate with a sample in our essay, in our sample here in the video. So again, in thinking about it, I'm going to start with the first point. And again, the first point was talking about the idea of labeling. So let's read it. The first point the professor addresses involves the reading's assertion that customers won't pay attention to the eco-certification because there are too many cheap competitors who use labels, such as new or improved, to promote their product. The professor argues that customers will pay attention to the eco-certified product because consumers are more ecologically aware and will trust an independent organization's evaluation. Now again, following through the 3 points we discussed in writing the body, first off, Did we follow the order of the lecture? Well, again, the first point was talking about the reading's assertion that customers won't pay attention to the eco-certification. And of course, this is the first point of the lecture. So the idea here is that the professor is addressing the reading point by point in the same order. So we need to make sure that that's the first point we try to make. Of course, we're comparing and contrasting with the reading, which we can find a little bit later. The professor is basically contrasting with that information. The professor argues something different from what the reading is saying. Now, in terms of the details, again, one thing I tried to do is use a lot of the same language that the reading was trying to use and the professor. So I tried to make sure I used words such as eco-certification or competitors, promoting a product. At the bottom, remember earlier when we analyzed the reading and the listening, we noticed use of the word independent organization or independent agency. So we tried to include as many of those details as possible. And then finally, thinking about attribution, well, again, we did mention what the reading is trying to say and what the professor is trying to say. So if you notice, what I'm doing here is I'm kind of framing the argument, how the professor addresses the reading and what exactly the professor is saying. So in a way, this is how I think the first point, how we can kind of get off to a good start, is to kind of follow the same sort of organization for the other 2 points that the professor is responding to. So again, in writing the body, let's kind of go back and clarify those particular ideas. In writing the body, we need to follow the order of the professor, who of course will be following the order of the reading. Include as many details as possible, and we need to think about getting the information correctly attributed to the right source. Now, a quick little tip here. You probably noticed that when we were writing our responses, we basically tried to keep a certain structure. It's not as formal as what you saw in the independent task, in which we had an introduction, a body, topic statement, sentences, conclusions, and so on. But I do think in terms of helping you as the writer separate each piece of information clearly, you might want to consider putting each part of the response into paragraphs. So in looking at our sample response so far, you'll notice how we try to separate each idea into different paragraphs. The first part, of course, is the topic statement. So as we said before, our goal is to kind of think of the topic statement as kind of like a thesis, kind of like an introduction. And the idea is that since it's kind of long, it's basically 2 sentences, I decided it probably would be better to make it actually 1 paragraph. And of course, the other 3 parts would be the body. Each paragraph refers to a different point that's being addressed by the professor. And again, I felt that was, again, a little bit easier to follow and read. So the goal really, I think, is in organizing your response. It's actually, fairly keeping very close to the organization the professor and the reading use. I think in a way that makes it a little bit easier for us. We don't have to worry as much about thinking, how am I going to organize or coming up with ideas to say. Now, whenever the reading and or the lecture includes specific terminology, now remember terminology, as we introduced back in the reading series, or we also call them technical terms, are words or concepts that are associated with a specific academic discipline. So, whenever you see those things, make sure to include the same ideas and terms in your response. So, for example, we've noticed that the words eco-certified or eco-certification are words that both sources use fairly frequently. These particular terms should appear in your response, and if you notice in the sample response we were putting together for this video, we used them quite a bit. Now, again, as we look through the reading, are there any other ideas or terms that seem to be repeated, or ideas or words that we need to use? Well, for example, if you look kind of at the beginning, I did reference some words that we hear a lot when involving forestry practices, and that is the idea of ecology, ecologically sustainable. These are particular words that I think would be very helpful to use because they are very much words that are part of forestry practice. Again, we see that word ecology or ecologically repeated. I think in a way that's something we need to continue to think about using in our response. Of course, we see some other terms that are not necessarily technical, but are definitely good to use. Again, talking about certification in general, or the idea of these particular prices, Cost, of course, are words that we might want to consider using. These are good words to use. Pursuing that certification, as we said before. So I think part of the idea here is that if we see words or ideas that are repeated, we probably should consider using them. There's another good word there, conserving resources and recycling materials. So we tried to use the word recycled and sustainable in our response. It, again, demonstrates that we kind of know what the reading is talking about. Now, thinking about the listening, again, in the lecture, any words or ideas being repeated, or even any new ideas or words that are being introduced for the first time. Well, again, as we look through, again, we talked about the idea of eco-certification, so yes, it's there. We're really talking a lot about wood companies. Since this is forestry, the idea of wood products, those kinds of things, we definitely need to make sure we use in our response. We did talk about that the professor is sort of introducing the concept of these independent certification agencies, and we mentioned earlier that he repeats them in various ways. Independent organization, for example, or independent consumer agency. We probably need to make sure we try to use these words in our response. In the second part of the listening, again, let's take a look and see. Again, there's the concept of price. Of course, the professor is indicating, if you recall, that price is not the only factor, but it is an important one. And of course, talking about, there it is, again, certified wood. Preserving and protecting the environment, which again, these are particular terms that certainly have different applications, but we hear them a lot when talking about forestry practices. Finally, the idea of a foreign market, foreign competition. These are probably words I need to use in my response. I hear them repeated, I hear them used, and they seem particularly important to this particular area. Wood companies, for example. So I think in a way we definitely need to pay attention and think about how we can emphasize our understanding of the reading and of the lecture by using the same language. So again, when you use those same technical terms, you're really demonstrating how you understand the ideas being presented in both sources. Now, however, I do need to kind of emphasize one important thing. This is not the opportunity to just repeat or copy whole sentences or phrases from the reading, or even the lecture if you're able to copy them down while you're listening. I think, in a way, this is often the signal to the test evaluator that you don't have enough English to write your own ideas and thoughts and ideas. So again, I'm not encouraging you to copy an entire sentence. Instead, I'm thinking about using a lot of the same terms because the idea here is that they want to see if you understand how to use them. Now, related to the idea of language, of course, we're talking mostly about vocabulary, but again, I think it's important that we need to review something we've talked about in several of the series, and that's the concept of cohesion. So, again, recall that part of the idea of this task is to think about reinforcing the different stances that the professor and the reading take. So we really do need to use the correct cohesive ideas to help the response kind of flow together. And as we mentioned earlier, the professor will probably use some sort of signal words to help demonstrate his or her stance towards a particular idea. So if, for example, since in this case the professor is disagreeing with the conclusions, they probably will use words of disagreement. We talked about that earlier. So in your own writing, you need to constantly reinforce this disagreement using appropriate signal words and other cohesive devices. So again, some ideas you might want to think about, and that way you can kind of avoid repeating yourself. You could say the professor contradicts this, or the professor counters that, the professor disapproves, the lecture disagrees, and you may even want to think about using some of these other types of words to reinforce that stance. However, in contrast, on the other hand, or on the contrary. Use of these particular signal ideas will help demonstrate to the evaluator that you understand both the idea of stance and of attribution, because you understand how the sources are relating to each other. So, therefore, if we see that since the professor is contradicting the information, or if he or she is adding information to the reading, we do need to use the appropriate signal words to help reinforce the professor's stance while also providing an important framework for the response. Now, as mentioned in the previous TOEFL speaking series, we do need to distinguish between preparing for taking the test and preparing for the response during the test. Now, just like I said for the integrated speaking section, because the integrated writing section here, the writing task, is so specific, I really would recommend that you need to purchase the official guide to the TOEFL IBT. I think this is ultimately the best way to prepare for this kind of activity, because really the TOEFL has its own specific expectation for this part of the test. So I think in this way, that's the only way you're going to be able to practice, is with using ETS authentic materials. Now, of course, ETS has lots of other materials that you can use, but I probably would recommend the official guide itself. Now, in thinking about preparing for the test, like actually writing the response during the test, let's talk about a particular strategy or plan. Now, if you recall, in the independent writing section, I referred to a certain plan. Well, I also have a plan here too, and I call that the 5-15 plan. Now, the 5-15 plan itself is divided by time, of course. Since we have 20 minutes to write the response, oftentimes students just want to jump in and start writing. And I think ultimately at the beginning that might be kind of difficult, especially if we're still getting used to this task and we need some time to go through our notes. So the first thing I kind of recommend is that in the first 5 minutes, you might want to take some time to review your notes from the listening passage. And of course, remember, the reading returns, so you need to take some time to review the main ideas from the reading passage. Now, as you get more skilled at this process, you will need less time, of course, to do this. But I think at the beginning, we have to get better at being able to write the response in a short amount of time. So again, you don't have a lot of time with this particular activity, but then again, the expectations are different. So in the final 15 minutes, I think that probably is going to be sufficient to write the topic sentence and the body. Of course, as you get better at this task, you will be able to save more time here and gain more time here. I think ultimately as you get better and more comfortable with the expectations of the task, you'll be able to write it certainly much faster. But of course, there is no substitute for real practice. You need to practice this task quite a bit in order to get better at writing in the time frame. And of course, it's important to remind us one more time that the reading does return during the writing portion of the integrated task. Now recall, even though you're not required to summarize all of the reading passage, as we've learned, you can't leave the reading passage out altogether. Recall that there are two different types of prompts that you could see on the TOEFL integrated writing task. The first one, of course, is the one we've been talking about in this video, of how the professor is casting doubt on the points made in the reading. So again, the idea here is that we cannot just summarize the professor's lecture, we have to connect it to what the points are in the reading as well, and the ones that he or she is responding to. And of course, the other prompt type, which we didn't explore in this video, but we do need to be aware of, is that also we're talking about how the mini lecture can add information to the information presented in the reading passage. So it's going to be very important to identify what the prompt is asking you to do. So again, don't forget that the reading is there for a reason. So you don't have to include every piece of information we see in the reading, but definitely those ideas or points that are being discussed in the listening passage. Remember that the best written responses do not include just a summary of the listening passage. They also include enough information in the reading to adequately address the requirements of the prompt. So our final thoughts on the integrated writing task. Once again, recall that there is one task that's involved on the test. You have to read a short passage at the beginning, and it's usually academic in nature. And remember, you have about 3 minutes to do so. Now, I recommended in the video that you probably don't have enough time to take notes, but you do have to pay attention to what the reading is saying, especially any repeated ideas or concepts, and of course, especially the language that's being used. And don't forget, of course, the technical terms that the professor, that the reading is using. Next is the listening passage, which, as we said, is usually a mini lecture delivered by a professor. It's around 2 to 3 minutes. During that time, you do need to identify the professor's stance. Does the professor basically agree and add more information, or disagree and cast doubt on the reading? Of course, we need to pay attention to any repeated ideas or words, or ideas introduced by the lecture, because again, we are going to need to use those in our response. And finally, don't forget, take notes. Make sure to follow the order of the lecture. And again, the lecture, of course, will usually be following the order of the reading. And finally, in the written response part, the idea is to synthesize elements from both the reading and the mini lecture, framing it, of course, using the lecture to how it relates to the reading. Again, recall that there are basically two parts: a topic statement, in which you're trying to establish the basic gist, which we can usually find at the beginning of the reading passage, and establish the stance, identify what is the reading saying versus what the lecture is saying. Of course, we also do this in the body. We follow the order of the professor and as we kind of summarize the information that's included. Don't forget to include as many details as possible, including the language that's being used. And don't forget, attribution is an important part. You have to be able to clearly identify what is the professor saying compared to what the reading is saying. Now, of course, we've mentioned throughout the video series there are lots of great materials out there to help you. And again, we've included links to many of those at the bottom of this video. There is the official TOEFL website and the TOEFL Go Anywhere website that ETS has put together. Of course, I've recommended throughout the series the official guide to the TOEFL test. Again, highly recommended. We do have a TOEFL TOEIC preparation website that you can find at the bottom of this video. I've mentioned The Essentials of English by Ann Hogue. I think that's important for any writing that you have to do in English. So again, I would recommend this book as well. And finally, we've mentioned it in the independent writing task. I also want to mention that ATS had published some official TOEFL responses for both of the writing tasks, with some different topics, of course. But you can find a link to that information below the video as well. So that way you can see another example of an integrated writing response. Thanks for watching. We'll see you for the final video of our TOEFL preparation series, wrapping up the TOEFL IBT.